So, hello and welcome back to another evening where we are going to attempt to recap a couple of chapters of the Phoenix Endangered. We're getting really close to the end of the book, and I feel like in a lot of books, that's when all the action happens. It's like the authors weave these threads and then they bring them all together right at the very end, which is, what you're supposed to do in a well-crafted story. It's got to be even harder, though, when you're working with like a trilogy or a quartet or a longer piece, because there's a lot more threads to weave. So, yeah, in the last couple of chapters, the city of Tarnatha Atreyu was surrounded by an Isvani army. Tercel went out to reason with them, and when that failed, he surrounded the entire city with mage shield, and then had to stay awake to maintain the mage shield. He did manage for about a week, which I give mad props for because I couldn't have done it. But right towards the end, he was starting to perhaps hallucinate. Hard to say that the red man, who might have been the bear, obviously was the red man who met them out on the road, and who also might have been the person chasing them around in one of the last cities that they were in the human lands. He was very insistent to Harrier that he saw him. I mean, granted, this was when he was probably hallucinating from lack of sleep, but that is one of those put a pin in that, it will probably come back later moments. But yeah, right at the very end, Tercel finally succumbs to lack of sleep, and Harrier takes him and barricades, is going to watch over him. Well, the plan was that all of the city militia would go out, and hopefully the Isvani army would be so exhausted and hungry and thirsty from besieging the city that it would just be a really easy mop-up operation. Harrier realizes too late that obviously that's not what happened. And he realizes it in a strange way. He realizes it because the city's too quiet. And that if it had gone to plan, he probably would have heard fighting and probably cheering from the city watch as they slaughter the enemy. And he's not hearing that. So, probably following some night mage instinct, he picks up Tercel, and we left him as he was getting ready to leave the room. And so we will be picking back up with my recap of chapters 16 and 17 of The Phoenix Unchained by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. And chapter 16 is titled Crowned in Fire. So, like I said, chapter 16 picks up with Harrier picking up Tercel. He does try to wake him up. It does not really work. And I'm sorry. If I were awake for a solid week, nobody's going to wake me up. I don't care. You could probably dunk me in icy water and I might make a noise, but I'm probably not waking up. At this point, it's just a lost cause. After he tries to wake him up, he mutters, you should have called Ann Keldar. Which, good advice, but towards the end there, Tercel was not doing anything. Now, carrying Tercel is quite the feat because both the boys, even though Harrier is a little bit bigger and a little bit more muscled up, they're about the same weight. So he has to set him down quite often. He is a little bit upset because he doesn't know the city as well as Tercel did, because Tercel spent the last however long they were in the city wandering around and talking to everybody, because that's just what Tercel does. And he also feels really guilty. Quoting, he tried not to think about what he was doing, saving himself and letting everyone else die. It didn't help that he knew he couldn't save them, that all he could probably do was die with them, that he had to save Tercel because Tercel might be the one who could save so many other people. All he could think of, because that's what it felt like, was that he was running away and saving himself because he was a coward. And it's in this frame of mind that he meets the first Isvani tribesman. And this guy comes around and he's just casually walking along. And Harrier thinks that he's maybe got like a melon or something. And it turns out that this dude is walking through the city carrying somebody's head. And he sees Harrier and he's like, hey, easy meat. And just like with Kellen, I am going to read a good chunk of this because I think it's one of the things that Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory do so well in these books is really humanize what the act of war does to somebody, like mentally, especially the first time that they have to dispatch an enemy. Harrier didn't know what was going to happen now, but he knew if he didn't stop this man would kill Tercel. That was all he was thinking about. He was exhausted and so terrified he was actually beyond fear. He couldn't remember a single thing that Telchi had ever told him about fighting, or even a single word he had ever read in any of his 3 books. Please, he thought. Please? And then the fight begins, and Harrier's body and night mage instincts take over until he dispatches his first enemy. Oh, light, Harrier stared down at the swords in his hands. Both the blades were bloody, and he couldn't remember how they had gotten that way. I'm sorry, he gasped. He took a step back. The blood was spreading fast. He wanted to throw his swords away. He didn't know what to do. He had just killed somebody, and all he could think of was that he would never dare tell his Da about this, never. He wanted to cry. Isn't this what you were trained to do? Isn't this what a night mage does? I don't want to be a night mage anymore. Please? But he pulls himself together. He unfortunately does not have a Germain there to guide him through the process of forgiving himself and forgiving the person that he killed, but he knows that he has to watch out for Tercel. And as they are kind of getting away, he's trying to move Tercel just by doing a drag at this point, because now he's even more exhausted. He suddenly looks up and sees Tercel's red man. Tercel had said he was some kind of other folk, and Harrier tried to see it, but he couldn't. Not really. The man had pale red hair and brown eyes that were almost red, but that wasn't enough, was it? You can see me, Harrier said slowly. Because if this was the same creature as before, he hadn't been able to see Harrier the last time. You have become real, the man said. Harrier didn't know what he meant, unless it was that he could see Harrier now that he was a wild mage. Harrier didn't really want to ask. Look, he said, I need to hide my friend. They're going to kill everyone in the city. Yes, the red man said. They're going to kill Tercel, said Harrier, trying to make the creature understand. If you wanted him dead, you had plenty of chances. If he dies, he's supposed to save everyone. The world is a dance of light and fire, the red man said. We are the heirs and the children of stars. Look, Harrier said, you need to leave now. I don't know why you're here or what you want, but you need to go away. No fire dies forever. New stars are born. He must still be proven, the red man said. Harrier is confused and annoyed by what the red man is saying. It makes absolutely no sense. And he tries again, and the red man asks, are you willing to die so that your friend can live? And Harrier's like, yes. I mean, it was why he was here, Harrier realized. It was why he had come all this way. It was why he had accepted the 3 books. He had never expected to become a Kellen and lead armies into battle. He just wanted to be able to get Tercel to where he was going. The red man then says that he's going to touch Harrier, and when he does, he disappears. He's gone. Unfortunately, he's gone, but now an entire squad of Isvani come around the corner. And Harrier fights. And he does a brilliant job, just like Kellen always did in the Obsidian trilogy. Harrier lets his instincts take over, and he pretty much wipes out the whole squad, but not quite. And he slips in a little bit of blood, and somebody knocks him on the head. Now, we rejoin Harrier, who knows how long later, as he is having drugged date wine forced down his throat. He discovers that he's being held prisoner. He's bound. He's gagged whenever they're not forcing this drugged wine down his throat. And all he knows is he's hot, he's blindfolded, and he's gagged. Then, after he didn't know how long, there were sounds loud enough to rouse him from his drugged sleep. Roaring, screams, the bawling of Shotars. Flee, human vermin! Flee, or I will destroy you all, a deep voice bellowed. And Keldar. There was a sudden, strong gust of wind that raised a choking cloud of dust, making Harrier sneeze and cough, and that wasn't a good idea right now because he still had a gag in his mouth. Ankildar roars a few more times. Harrier hears crunching noises, and then sudden brightness, even bright enough to make him wince, despite the fact that he's wearing a blindfold, as Harrier rips the tent right off from up above Harrier's head. Ankildar can't exactly untie him, but he does point out that his claws are very sharp, and he'll guide Harrier over, and Harrier can just, rub whatever's tying his hands together on Ankildar's claw and untie himself. It works. At the cost of some more scrapes and bruises, but Harrier gets the bindings off of his hands. He immediately is in incredible pain because his hands have been tied behind his back for who knows how long. But the first thing he does as soon as he can move his shoulders again is pull the blindfold off and immediately regret it because it's the middle of the day in the Mandirian desert. He tells Ankildar to find Tercel. He's going to try his hardest to use a piece of glass that he found to untie his feet and kind of wake his body up as much as he can. A few minutes later, Ankildar calls that he has found Tercel, and thankfully, this time Harrier's actually able to move and walk. Hobble. He's more likely hobbling. Ankildar guides Harrier to a little bit of water and then sends Harrier in to rescue his bonded, because as Ankildar told Harrier a long time ago, he's a dragon. He can't get in there and untie Tercel. He can't wake him up. All he can do is what he's doing now. Tercel wakes up and lets Harrier know that, yeah, as soon as he roused enough to know that he had been taken captive somewhere, he woke up Ankildar, which is probably a very good thing. And Harrier lets Tercel know that he saw the red man. And Tercel's like, the who? And Harrier lets him know that you raved about him like the last couple days that you were awake, which Tercel doesn't really remember, not surprising. And Tercel's like, I probably was thinking I was the blessed Saint Adalia at the end of that too, but what does that have to do with the red man? Harrier lets Tercel know that he had a wonderful conversation with the red man. He asked what I would do to get you out of the city alive, and then we got captured by a bunch of Isvani, so I guess technically we got out of the city alive. The boys work on getting their circulation back. They work on trying to find something to eat. Ankildar lets them know that they were being held captive by a small band of Isvani, less than like 20 people, and that all of the rest of the Isvani army seems to have departed. The city is still standing. They didn't burn it to the ground. And they've been held captive, as near as Ankildar can tell, for about 5 days. Harrier and Tercel ask Ankildar to maybe see where all the rest of the Isvani are while they work on, cleaning up and trying to find some food, trying to get out of the sun, finding some water, all of those things. Ankildar agrees and says, maybe I'll go eat a few of the Isvani's shotars. Harrier and Tercel talk about the Isvani army and what could have driven them to do this. And they agree that basically it was somebody obviously that had deluded them, that they seemed to believe some sort of a lie about the false balance, and they just don't know. After Ankildar departs, Tercel and Harrier go down to some of the watering, like irrigation ditches, which actually have water in them, which is good because they both kind of want to at least get wet, try and clean off, try and not feel like they've been held prisoner for a week. And that's when Tercel notices that Harrier's outfit, his tunic, is completely covered in blood. Quoting, "This has blood all over it," Tercel said, picking up Harrier's tunic from where he had dropped it in a sodden lump on the ground. Harrier had started to scrub himself with it, seen how soiled it was, and simply tossed it aside. "They hit me on the head. I bled," said Harrier. He was holding up a wad of wet cloth to the back of his head. The cold felt good, and maybe he could soak the blood out of his hair eventually. "In the back?" said Tercel. "Not the front? There's blood on the front of your tunic. I said they hit me in the head, said Harrier. Why? Tressel asked. Because they're murderous darkspawn, and I was trying to get us somewhere to hide you so you could wake up and call Ankildar. You killed one of them, said Tressel, as if he had suddenly figured out an answer. That's why. Harrier began to laugh. He didn't know why hearing Tressel say something that was only the truth hurt so much. You always think you can do things so much better than I can, he said, hating himself but unable to stop. How many did you kill when you threw Mage's shield up right in front of them? Maybe I didn't kill as many as you did, but at least I got my hands dirty. I got my hands dirty. And then Harrier goes off to try to wash the blood off of him. Tressel does note that it almost seems like Harrier is trying to scrub the skin off of his arms. They do make up. Tressel, lets him know that it's okay. Harrier doesn't think that it will ever be okay. But Harrier points out that, he didn't have a choice. Harrier then tells him to stop talking. It's fine. Just drop it. And a couple hours later, Ankildar comes back. They did find some food, which definitely makes Harrier feel a little bit better. And they watch Ankildar come spiraling in, and as they do, when Ankildar passes over the city, suddenly the entire sky is just filled with carrion birds, and they just, they're overwhelmed. And Tressel and Harrier both think that a lot of the stuff that they needed was in that city, but they don't think that they can bring themselves to go back there. The next morning, Tressel and Harrier realize that, well, not even the next morning, about the middle of the night, when desert winds change directions, they're woken up because, well, the desert wind changed directions, and now it's blowing from the city and blowing the smell of rotting corpses on them. This makes them realize that they can't stay there. We can't stay here, Tressel said. I've got a whole list of reasons why it's going to be really hard for us to leave. Want to hear them? Said Harrier. In the distance, they heard something bark and then yowl. Didn't sound like a dog or a wolf, but Harrier couldn't ID it. Sure, said Tressel. And so Harrier sat down beside him, next to the fire, and listed all the reasons that he had thought of. They had no way to ride Ankildar without his saddle. Even with the saddle, they had no way to carry supplies for an extended journey. They had to wait until they knew exactly where they were going, and then they had to go there all at once. The same problems applied if they just wanted to move a little ways away from where they were. There was only one source of water anywhere nearby, and they had no way to move the tents, their only form of shelter. And there was probably enough in the way of food here to last them maybe a se'night or so. Hopefully by then they would know where they were going, but they couldn't carry it with them. Harrier, said Tressel, we can't stay here. If you've got any idea of how we can leave and stay alive and figure out where we're going, then I'm all for hearing it. I don't like this any better than you do. A spell, Ankildar told them. And Ankildar basically tells Tressel that he does know one good spell that will work on getting rid of the stench from the city anyway. And that is where the chapter ends, because Tercel figures out what Ankildar is talking about, and the chapter ends with the sentence, "A couple hours later, Harrier found out what he meant as well." All right, I'm going to get a drink, and then we are going to move on to reviewing, recapping, whatever you want to call it, chapter 17. So give me 1 minute. All right, we are back. We are recapping chapter 17 of The Phoenix Endangered by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. Chapter 17 is titled Unmade by Magic. So what Ankildar suggested and Tercel agreed to was transmuting all of the stone in the city to water. That would get rid of the city walls, and then he and Harrier could burn the bodies. It would definitely get rid of the smell. The only concern is that Tercel doesn't actually know where the city's well is, but thankfully Harrier does. Tercel then begins to transmute one wall at a time to water, which in the desert heat immediately evaporates. And Harrier suddenly realizes that this is something he's seen already. The day was bright, and the sky was clear, and he stood upon a plain in the midst of a lake, not a lake of fire, but a lake of water, and a quiet, sad voice, it came from outside, but somehow it seemed to be his, spoke, saying, "This is Tarnatha Atreyu. This is all that remains." With a sudden shock, Harrier realized that this was what he had seen in the scrying bowl. Then Tercel just basically comments, "I told you transmutation was easy," but Harrier is feeling a little bit shocked because he didn't understand what he had seen when he had scryed for the future, and now he does. They go ahead and they transmute everything and then start picking through the ruins, burning the dead bodies, and basically salvaging what they can. They manage to salvage some leather, not quite a saddle, but some leather. They managed to salvage some more foodstuffs, so that's good. They've got a little bit more supplies. And Harrier is thinking with his stomach, as he always does. As he dug through a basket of something that might be turnips or potatoes or flower bulbs, his fingers encountered something at the bottom of the basket that was definitely not a turnip or a flower bulb. He pulled it out and then held them up, peering at them in the ball of cold fire that hovered on his left shoulder. His books. "This is weird," he said aloud. Kerta had said that they couldn't be taken from him, but he had not thought that that meant that they would show up in the bottom of a basket of turnips. That was just no weirder than any other piece of magic, I guess. He tucked them into his sash, folding the fabric carefully over them so they wouldn't fall down, and went back to selecting items for a stew. Later on, like I said, they find some leather, and Tercel's like, I could probably make at least some sort of a harness to hold us onto Ankildar's neck, and that would probably work. When Ankildar returned, a lot later, Harrier's practicing fire and thinking about magic, as always. Doing magic like this, the kind where he had a choice about doing it or not, always left him feeling as if he was trying to put his foot on a step that wasn't there, no matter how often it worked. He was starting to wonder if maybe the only thing that wild mages really had to practice was the idea of flinging themselves into the wild magic as if they were jumping over the side of a ship in the midst of the great ocean and not caring what happened next because it would be whatever the wild magic wanted. If that was what it took to be a good wild mage, thought Harrier, he was always going to suck at it. Now, I don't know if that seemed as jarring to you as it did to me, but I've noticed that probably because Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory wanted to set this book in a more modern time, they actually give Harrier and Tercel a little bit more modern, like, turns of phrase. But I know the first time I read he was always going to suck at it, I was like, somehow that just jarred me right out of the book. It does make me laugh now, but yes, that is the exact turn of phrase in this book. Anyway, Harrier goes on practicing burning, and he's getting good at it, but he doesn't really see the point. He could make a fire almost as fast with flint and steel, and it wouldn't make him feel so weird. When Ankildar comes back, he tells them that after hunting and checking on the progress of the Isvani, he had flown to the edge of the Mandarian desert and where all the rest of the Atreyu cities are, and they're all gone. Every last one of them. And there were 11 cities in all, and now there are not, well, there's one left, according to Ankildar. But all the rest are gone, including the one that Tercel just transmuted into water. Ankildar also lets them know that, it seems like the Isvani that he has been shadowing from high in the sky are all headed somewhere now. At first, it was they seemed to be meandering hither and thither and yon, but they all seem to be going somewhere now. Harrier thinks that it's too bad that they don't have a map so that, they could at least plot where the Isvani were going on a map. And Tercel says that he could draw a map, at least of the Isvani part, not the whole desert, but he's been studying it and he could draw a map. By the time Tercel was done, Harrier had a confused picture of a large hostile desert with oases just close enough together that a determined traveler on a shotar could manage to get from one to the next without dying. To get anywhere in the Isvai involved taking a route that wove the path like a drunken sailor from one dockside tavern to the next. Actually, not quite that straight. Ankildar lets them know that where the Isvani seem to be headed is hotter than where they are now. And Harrier asks, how are we supposed to follow them? Because we're going to have to ride on Ankildar, obviously. He doesn't have a saddle anymore, and we have no way to carry supplies. Tercel lets Harrier know that he'll think of something. And that something is, yes, taking the leather that they found and making some sort of a strap to go around Ankildar's neck, and then, a belt to go around each of them that they can tie to the strap. Harrier doesn't like this idea, but he doesn't have any better idea. It doesn't make him feel any better that Ankildar doesn't like this idea either. But considering they can't find the saddle and there's nothing else that they can think of to do, that's what they end up doing. They spend the last little bit of time near the ruins of Tarnatha Atreyu, just kind of getting as ready as they can. They figure that Ankildar has seen that not only are the Isvani headed somewhere, but he can see it's almost like a road, because in the desert the desert turf. I guess it wouldn't be turf. I don't know what the term is for the desert floor. It holds marks for a very long time, especially marks of thousands of people marching across it. So Ankildar can now see where the Isvani are going. So now their grand plan, now that they have made a harness for Ankildar, even if Ankildar and Harrier don't think it's going to actually work. So they're just going to get on Ankildar, fly probably straight to the Lake of Fire. Bada bing, bada boom, Bob's your uncle. They'll deal with whoever the fire woman is talking to. And yeah, sure. Then be back in Arameth in time for dinner. That never works. But that's about as good of a plan as they've got. So they mount up on Ankildar in the morning, and Harrier is not very impressed. In the last several moon turns, Harrier had seen Ankildar take off and land so many times he had lost count. In the last fortnight, he had seen him take off and land from the plain outside the orchard twice a day. It was different when you were sitting on his back. In the first place, he ran fast, and there were no stirrups and no real way to hold on. They were both straddling Ankildar's neck, and his scales were slippery, and Tercel was clutching at the neck strap, and Harrier was holding on to Tercel as hard as he could, and the landscape blurred past. Then suddenly Ankildar snapped his wings open and lunged upward like a cat after a butterfly. And then he was beating his wings frantically, and Harrier had his eyes tightly shut, and Tercel was complaining that he couldn't breathe, and Harrier had a terrifying sense of gliding and falling, and he could feel the wind rising against his face. Then after a long time, minutes, that nothing happened, Harrier opened his eyes. And he is astonished because they're up at like airplane cruising velocity, at least maybe for a small airplane, and everything looks very, very small. Tercel tells Harrier to relax because it used to be Tercel that was afraid of heights, and now it seems to be Harrier that's panicking. I don't blame him. I think you would have to bespell me to sleep to get me to do what the boys are doing right now. I don't think I would be able to do it. No. In fact, no, I know I wouldn't. Harrier is amazed at passing over the first group of Isvani because it's men in shotars. That's things that he knows the size of, but they look about like ants. Harrier wonders what would happen if they look up and see them. And Tercel's like, people never look up. And besides, I kind of cast a spell, so they aren't going to look up and see us. A couple hours later, the Ankildar announces that they should soon reach their destination. Harrier could see, once he looks down, that they had passed another group of Isvani, and that there definitely seems to be a trail, a road, or something that they're following. But when they had flown for another hour, covering hundreds of miles, they had to, because it had taken Ankildar less than 2 hours to cover the same distance that the Isvani had taken 3 Sen nights of travel for, they began to realize that reaching their destination would not be simple. "Hey," said Tercel, "is that a second group?" "It's not," said Ankildar. Harrier looked down. The Isvani caravan was below them again. "But you've been flying straight the whole time." "So I had thought," said Ankildar. And he flew on, and an hour later they encountered the same group again. They realized that somebody has put a spell that is managing to turn Ankildar away from it. It seems to be some sort of a spell shield that Tercel can't exactly sense. Ankildar tried everything that any of them could think of. Flying east and circling around, flying west and doing the same. Everything that they could think of to somehow go around whatever it was that blocked them, but nothing worked. The sun was climbing towards mid-heaven now, and even though they were high above the desert heat, they were still hungry and thirsty, and both Harrier and Tercel were worn down with the tension of waiting for something to happen. It was small consolation to know that they had finally found the place Tercel needed to go if they couldn't get there. Finally, Ankildar climbs up into the high, cool air and just kind of circles while Harrier and Tercel attempt to hold a shouted conversation up in the high air of trying to figure out what they're supposed to do. They could go back to the elves and ask the elven mages to come help, but Harrier doesn't really think that that's going to work because they had sent Tercel off and figured that he could deal with it in the first place. They could fly back to Arameth, except if they do that, well, they'll probably get locked up by their parents, and yeah, that probably won't work. And finally, Ankildar comes up with the best version of a plan that they have, which is Ankildar will drop them off. He thinks that he saw something that looked like there was water and shade, at least. He'll drop them off. He'll go back to Tarnathe Atreyu, get the tents, get the supplies, and then carry it in his claws back to them. And then Harrier and Tercel, after Ankildar also kidnaps some Shotars, will just follow the road. Obviously, it's turning away magic, but since the Isvani are going there, it's not turning away mere humans, so it should work. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. Harrier doesn't like this idea, but it is what it is. And Ankildar says, "There's a place that I saw. There's even water there." Tercel gets very excited when Ankildar drops them off in this place that he saw from above, because he realizes here in the middle of the desert is a city. Harrier points out that it's the ruins of a city, not actually a city. And they settle down near kind of what looks to them to be a basement entrance. They get a drink at the spring, which Ankildar was right. There seems to be a spring or a well there, and they're going to wait in the shade for Ankildar to come back with supplies and Shotars, and we'll leave them with the last couple paragraphs that I will quote. There was a well. It was down at the bottom of a flight of stairs, and it was open to the sky. The air directly around the well was a little cooler than everywhere else here, probably because the sun was sucking the water into the air, but even so, the stone of the basement was too hot to kneel on until they splashed water from the water skin that Harrier carried on it. The stone didn't quite sizzle, but the water dried almost immediately, and as soon as it did, the stone heated up again. Everything in the direct sunlight was hot enough to cook on. Harrier took the precaution of refilling the water skin that he carried, even though they both drank directly from the well itself. It was just as well that Ankildar had been right about there being shelter here, because unless they climbed directly into the well itself, Harrier didn't think that they could survive here at all for very long, and even if they did, they'd be badly burned. But a sort of tunnel led off from the basement, and while neither of them was in any mood to go exploring, once they had gone a few feet along it, they were at least out of the sun. Even that much shelter was enough to make them feel cooler, and after a few minutes of exposure in the sun of the desolation, it felt good. then they settled in to wait for Ankildar. And that is where the chapter ends. And I'm sure you have all realized that, yes, indeed, they have made it to Abi Abadashar, which is where Shariah and her Nalzindar are. Should be fun when the two groups meet. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the recap. I really like, and it feels weird to say that I like the way that Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory write about stuff like war and Harrier and Kellen and their experience of killing their first human, but it just feels so much more real. I mean, it's not an experience I've ever had. I think I said back when we were reading the Obsidian trilogy that I've only ever killed deliberately one thing, and it was a pigeon, and I think I reacted about the same way Harrier did. And that's been the only, well, we aren't counting mosquitoes, spiders, ticks. We're not going to count bugs, but that's the only thing that I had ever deliberately taken the life of. And it messed me up, and I don't think I could do it again to this day. So I really appreciate it. It feels real. Like, I can't imagine that an experience like that would not massively change you and not massively mess up your mind, at least for a little while. I mean, we saw Tercel, he can't bring himself to deliberately hurt anything, including the goblins. I mean, the goblins that he killed were enough for him. So I appreciate the gravity that they give to it. Like, even if it's the enemy, it would still mess you up, at least in my mind. Anyway, enough of me babbling. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed those recaps. I don't know how many chapters we have left. 18. I'm thinking we will be done fairly soon. Let me just sit here and page through this. All right, there are 21 and an epilogue. So yeah, we will probably be finishing up this book, and then we'll only have one left of this trilogy. After this is done, I don't know if I'm still going to do book recaps. Let me know what you guys think. I kind of feel like sometimes I'm just babbling, but then sometimes I'm having fun with it. So let me know what y'all think, and I will see you next time.